On July 1st, 1981, at 3 in the morning, someone walked into a house on Wonderland Avenue in Los Angeles and erased 4 lives with hammers and metal pipes. A 5th victim survived, but her memory didn't. The scene was so savage that veteran detectives compared it to the Tate LaBianca tragedies. They knew who did it. They knew why. They had witnesses, evidence, and a clear motive. But here's what makes this story different from every other true crime case you've heard. Knowing the truth and proving it in court are 2 very different things. This is the story of the Wonderland case, a collision of Hollywood's underground organized crime and a justice system that crumbled under its own corruption. 43 years later, no one has been convicted of these deaths, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because sometimes the system itself becomes the accomplice. This is a true story, and if cases like this keep you awake at night, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Midnight File. My name is Julian Cross, and tonight we're opening a file that Hollywood tried very hard to forget. Let me take you back to a summer night in 1981. Laurel Canyon, a neighborhood tucked into the Hollywood Hills, where musicians and actors and people chasing dreams lived in houses that clung to winding roads and eucalyptus-scented air. During the day it looked almost idyllic, but at night certain addresses told a different story. 8763 Wonderland Avenue was one of those addresses. From the outside, it was just another 2-story townhouse with peeling paint and overgrown shrubs. But inside, it was something else entirely. A 24-hour party that never seemed to end. A revolving door of drug dealers, addicts, musicians, and people society had labeled as lost causes. The neighbors had learned to ignore the shouting, the crashes, the sound of furniture breaking at 3 in the morning. They assumed it was just another night of excess, another pharmaceutical haze, another Tuesday. But on July 1st, 1981, the screams were different. Someone heard a man begging for his life, pleading, the kind of sound that reaches into your chest and twists. And then silence, the kind that feels heavier than noise. By the time the sun rose over Laurel Canyon, 4 people were gone, and a 5th was clinging to life with injuries so catastrophic that she would never remember what happened. The Los Angeles Police Department sent 2 of their best, Detective Tom Lang and Detective Bob Souza, from the elite robbery homicide division. These were men who had seen things that would break most people, crime scenes that defied explanation, violence that stripped away any romantic notion of what their job entailed. But when they walked into 8763 Wonderland Avenue that morning, even they stopped. The townhouse had been torn apart, furniture overturned, drawers emptied, blood on the walls, the floors, the ceilings. It looked like rage had been given physical form and let loose inside those walls. 4 bodies, positioned throughout the house in a way that suggested this wasn't spontaneous. This was methodical, calculated. Someone had moved through that space with a purpose. Let me tell you who they found. Ronald Lee Laurnius, 37 years old, the leader of what people called the Wonderland Gang. A career criminal who had spent most of his adult life in and out of prison. Assault, robbery, drug trafficking. He wasn't a good man by any conventional definition, but he was a human being. And someone had beaten him so severely that his skull had fractured into pieces. The coroner would later say the number of strikes to his head suggested this wasn't just about ending a life. It was about sending a message. William Raymond Deverell, 42, Ron's second-in-command. They found him propped against a television stand, a claw hammer resting on the bed nearby. He had fought. You could see it in the defensive wounds on his arms. But it hadn't mattered. Joy Audrey Gold Miller, 46. She was the one who held the lease on the house, a heroin user who had survived breast cancer just 6 months earlier, enduring a mastectomy that should have been her second chance at life. Instead, she died from blunt force trauma in a house she had tried to call home. Barbara Lee Richardson, 22 years old. They called her Butterfly. She was the girlfriend of David Lind, another member of the gang. She had been sleeping on the couch when the attackers came in. They found her on the living room floor, 22 years old. Her whole life should have been ahead of her. And then there was Susan Murphy Laurnius, 25, Ron's wife. She was still alive when the paramedics arrived, but barely. Critical brain damage. a skull so shattered that surgeons would have to remove portions of it just to keep her alive. She lost parts of her fingers, and she lost something else that night, her memory. Every detail of what happened vanished into a fog she would never escape. Susan would survive. But the woman who walked out of that hospital months later wasn't the same person who had lived at Wonderland Avenue. She couldn't tell the police what she had seen. She couldn't identify who had done this. The only living witness, and her testimony was locked away forever. Detectives Lang and Souza stood in that house and tried to make sense of the scene. The level of violence was staggering. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The attackers hadn't been surprised or panicked. Every strike had been intentional. Overkill, they called it, when someone keeps hitting long after the victim is incapacitated. It's personal, it's rage, or it's a message. And there was something else, the way the bodies were positioned, the fact that Ron Laurel, the gang leader, had been searched more thoroughly than the others. Someone had been looking for something. Within hours, the detectives had a theory, and it led them to a name that would dominate Los Angeles headlines for years to come. Eddie Nash. Let me tell you about Eddie Nash, because to understand what happened at Wonderland Avenue, you need to understand the man who built an empire on Hollywood's appetite for excess. Eddie Nash wasn't his real name. He was born Adel Garib Nasrallah in Mandatory Palestine in 1929. He arrived in America in the early 1950s with $7 and a dream that had nothing to do with legitimacy. By the 1970s, he owned an empire. Nightclubs, restaurants, dozens of properties scattered across Los Angeles. The Starwood in West Hollywood was his crown jewel, a place where rock bands played and celebrities mingled, and everyone pretended not to notice what was really happening in the back rooms. On the surface, Eddie Nash was a successful businessman, but beneath that veneer he controlled one of the most profitable drug trafficking operations in the city. He had connections to organized crime families, Israeli mafia, Armenian mafia, even the Los Angeles crime family. He moved cocaine by the kilogram, and by the late 70s, he had become one of his own best customers. Nash rarely left his Studio City mansion. He would sit in his home, consuming massive amounts of cocaine, hosting parties that lasted days, conducting business from a leather chair while the drug ate away at whatever moral foundation he might have once possessed. People feared Eddie Nash, not just because he was powerful, but because he was unpredictable. Cocaine psychosis has a way of turning successful criminals into paranoid tyrants, and Nash embodied both. But even tyrants have vulnerabilities. And Eddie Nash's vulnerability walked on two legs and answered to the name John Holmes. If you were alive in the 1970s and paid any attention to the adult film industry, or even if you didn't, you knew who John Holmes was. He was the biggest star in an industry that didn't usually make stars. Over 500 films. A household name, at least in the households willing to admit it. In February 1985, they immortalized his handprints and footprints in cement outside the Pussycat Theater. Fame, success, everything a person could want. Except John Holmes was drowning. Cocaine addiction doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about your fame or your bank account. By the late 70s, Holmes owed money to everyone. And one of the people he owed money to was Eddie Nash. Holmes had been working as a middleman, connecting Nash's cocaine to buyers, including the Wonderland gang. It was a dangerous position to be in. Nash trusted him, to the extent Nash trusted anyone, and the Wonderland gang used him to the extent they used anyone. But Holmes made a mistake, or maybe several mistakes. He botched a delivery, failed to pay what he owed, and the Wonderland gang didn't respond with patience. They beat him, badly. The kind of beating that leaves bruises under bruises and makes you reconsider every choice that led you to that moment. So when Eddie Nash needed someone on the inside, someone who could unlock doors and provide information, John Holmes was the perfect candidate. Desperate, scared, drowning in debts he couldn't pay. On June 29, 1981, John Holmes visited Eddie Nash's Studio City mansion 3 times, 3 separate visits in one morning, and on that third visit, something changed, because that afternoon, 4 men walked into Eddie Nash's home and took everything. The robbery was audacious, methodical, the kind of crime that requires inside knowledge. Ronald Laurel, William Deverell, David Lind, and a man named McCourt entered Nash's mansion armed and ready. They found Nash's bodyguard, Gregory DeWitt Dials, and shot him. Not fatally, but enough to incapacitate him. And then they cleaned the place out. $1 million in cocaine, cash, jewelry, antique firearms, Quaaludes by the pound. Everything Nash had built, everything he had protected, gone in less than an hour. But more than the monetary loss, what destroyed Eddie Nash was the humiliation. These were people he considered beneath him, street-level criminals, and they had violated his sanctuary. They had shot his bodyguard, a man Nash considered almost family. This wasn't just theft, this was disrespect, and Eddie Nash did not forgive disrespect. Within hours, Nash's associates found John Holmes wearing some of Nash's stolen jewelry, rings that had been taken during the robbery. Holmes might as well have signed a confession. They dragged him back to Nash's home, tied him to a chair. And Gregory Dials, the bodyguard who had been shot during the robbery, now recovered enough to exact revenge, began to work on him. There was a witness to what happened next. His name was Scott Thorson, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because Scott Thorson lived one of the most surreal lives in American history. He had been the lover of Liberace, the flamboyant pianist whose life was later dramatized in an HBO film called Behind the Candelabra, with Matt Damon playing Thorson. Scott Thorson was at Nash's home on the morning of July 1st, 1981, buying substances, and he claimed he saw everything. According to Thorson, John Holmes was tied to a chair and beaten. Dials struck him repeatedly while Nash screamed questions. Where were the people who robbed him? What were their names? Where did they live? Holmes broke. Of course he broke. Most people would. He gave them an address, 8763 Wonderland Avenue. And then, according to Thorson, Eddie Nash said 6 words that would define the next 4 decades of legal battles. End everyone who's there. If you're still with me, subscribe to this channel. Because the deeper we go into this case, the darker it gets, and you'll want to see where this leads. 40 hours after the robbery, someone walked into the Wonderland house with hammers and metal pipes. The timeline matters here. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. This was planned. 40 hours gave the attackers time to prepare, to gather weapons, to decide how they wanted this to unfold. And when they entered that townhouse in the early hours of July 1st, they weren't there to send a warning. They were there to erase the problem entirely. Detective Lang and Detective Souza knew almost immediately that this was retaliation for the Nash robbery. The connection was too obvious, the timing too precise. But knowing something and proving it are different challenges entirely. They had circumstantial evidence, they had motive, they had opportunity. What they didn't have was definitive proof. The crime scene yielded one crucial piece of forensic evidence, a left-handed palm print on the headboard of Ron Laurnius's bed. The print belonged to John Holmes. Holmes had been there, either during the attacks or shortly after, but the print alone didn't prove he had participated in the violence. It proved he had touched a headboard, and defense attorneys could build entire careers on that kind of ambiguity. The detectives brought Holmes in for questioning. He refused to cooperate. Completely. He wouldn't confirm or deny anything, wouldn't explain the palm print, wouldn't discuss Eddie Nash or the robbery or what he had been doing at Wonderland Avenue. John Holmes knew that silence was his only protection, because the moment he started talking, he would implicate himself in something he might not be able to escape. The district attorney's office charged Holmes with 4 counts of being involved in the loss of life. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Holmes had facilitated the attacks. He had unlocked doors during his visits to Nash's home, allowing the robbery to succeed. And then, when Nash discovered Holmes's betrayal, he had sent Holmes back to Wonderland Avenue to guide the attackers inside. The trial began in March 1982. Prosecutor Ron Cohen presented the palm print, the timeline, the motive. He argued that Holmes was a willing participant who had orchestrated the violence as revenge for not receiving his share of the robbery proceeds. But the defense told a different story. They painted Holmes as a victim, a man trapped between 2 criminal enterprises, coerced under threat of violence against his family. A pawn, not a perpetrator. The jury deliberated, and on June 26, 1982, they returned a verdict, not guilty on all counts. John Holmes walked free. He served 110 days in jail for contempt of court, for refusing to cooperate with authorities. But he was never convicted of the actual violence. The acquittal sent shockwaves through the case. If Holmes wasn't guilty, then who was? And if the only person physically connected to the scene was innocent, how could they convict anyone else? Detective Lang and Detective Souza didn't give up. They knew Eddie Nash had ordered the attacks. They knew Gregory Diles had likely carried them out, but they needed evidence that would satisfy a jury. And that evidence proved maddeningly elusive. 8 years passed. 8 years of dead ends and frustrated investigators, and a case that seemed to mock everyone who tried to solve it. And then, in 1990, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office decided to try again. This time they charged Eddie Nash and Gregory Diles directly, not as accessories, as the masterminds and executors. The key witness was Scott Thorson, the former lover of Liberace, now willing to testify about what he had seen at Nash's home. Thorson described Holmes tied to a chair, described the beating, described Nash screaming orders to end everyone at Wonderland Avenue. It should have been enough. Eyewitness testimony to premeditation, a clear motive, a timeline that made sense. But there was a problem. Scott Thorson was Scott Thorson. His credibility was, to put it generously, questionable. His life was a series of embellishments and contradictions and stories that seemed designed more for attention than truth. He had spent years riding the coattails of celebrities, first Liberace, then Hollywood's criminal underworld. His drug use was well documented, his reliability less so. The defense tore into him during cross-examination. They highlighted every inconsistency, every exaggeration, every reason a jury might doubt his word. The trial ended in May 1990 with a hung jury. 11 jurors voted to convict Eddie Nash. 1 juror held out. A single vote prevented justice. As for Gregory Diles, 10 jurors voted for acquittal, 2 for conviction. He walked free. The prosecution announced a retrial, and in 1991, they tried again. This time, both Nash and Diles were acquitted. The jury simply didn't believe the evidence rose to the level of reasonable certainty, and the prosecution, exhausted and defeated, announced they were abandoning the case. For nearly a decade, it seemed like the Wonderland case would remain unsolved forever. Eddie Nash had escaped conviction twice. John Holmes was dead. He had passed away in March 1988 from AIDS-related complications at age 43, taking whatever truth he knew to his grave. Gregory Diles continued working for Nash as if nothing had happened. The case was cold. The perpetrators were free. And the families of the victims were left with nothing but anger and grief, and the knowledge that the system had failed them. But then, something unexpected happened. In 2000, federal authorities decided to approach the case from a different angle. Not as a matter of state law, but as federal organized crime. They charged Eddie Nash under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, the same statute used to dismantle mafia families and drug cartels. The charges included drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy related to the Wonderland violence. More importantly, federal charges carried no statute of limitations. The passage of time didn't matter. If Nash had committed federal offenses, he could be prosecuted decades later. And there was one more revelation that changed everything. During the federal investigation, authorities discovered that the single juror who had prevented Nash's conviction in 1990, the holdout who had saved him from a guilty verdict, had been bribed. $50,000, paid by Nash's associates to ensure she voted not guilty. Jury tampering, one of the most serious offenses in the American legal system. Eddie Nash, now in his 70s and suffering from emphysema, faced the prospect of dying in federal prison. And so, in September 2001, he accepted a plea deal. He admitted to bribing the juror. He admitted to running a drug trafficking operation. And he admitted to ordering associates to retrieve his stolen property from the Wonderland house, property that might have resulted in violence, including the loss of life. But he didn't admit to ordering the actual attacks, just the retrieval of his belongings, a carefully worded confession that acknowledged the outcome without accepting full responsibility. Nash received 37 months in federal prison, approximately 4.5 years, plus a $250,000 fine. He served his time at Terminal Island Federal Prison in Southern California. And on August 9, 2014, Eddie Nash died of natural causes. He was 85 years old. If this story has stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think really happened, because this case lives in the space between what we know and what we can prove, and that's where it gets interesting. Gregory Diles never faced federal charges. He died of liver failure on January 16, 1997, at age 48, just as the federal investigation was intensifying. Scott Thorson lived a chaotic life until his final days. In 1991, he was shot 3 times in a Jacksonville, Florida motel room by a dealer and survived. He spent 4 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to felony charges in 2008. And in 2024, before his passing from cancer and heart issues at age 65, he gave extensive interviews for Michael Connelly's documentary series about the case. His accounts continued to oscillate between the plausible and the implausible. But he never wavered on one detail. He had been at Nash's home. He had seen Holmes beaten. He had heard Nash give the order. Whether you believe Scott Thorson is a question each person has to answer for themselves. John Holmes's widow, Sharon Holmes, gave an interview in April 1988, 1 month after his passing. She claimed that John had come home with blood on his clothes the night of the attacks and had confessed to leading the perpetrators into the house. He had stood by while they carried out the violence, but Sharon only came forward after John was gone, after he couldn't defend himself or clarify or provide his own version. And so, like everything else in this case, her testimony exists in a fog of uncertainty. Before he passed, John Holmes was hospitalized at the VA hospital. Detectives Lang and Souza made one final attempt to extract a confession. They stood by his bedside and pleaded with him to tell the truth, to give the families closure, to let the world know what really happened. John Holmes refused. He kept his silence until the very end. The Wonderland case has been immortalized in 2 major cultural productions that highlight the tension between what we know and what we can prove. In 2003, director James Cox released a film called Wonderland, featuring Val Kilmer as John Holmes. The film used a non-linear, Rashomon-style narrative that presented multiple perspectives on the same events. It refused to impose a clean moral conclusion. Roger Ebert praised Kilmer's performance, noting his ability to convey Holmes as simultaneously guilty and innocent, charming and ugly, paranoid and self-pitying. The film didn't solve the case, it dramatized its ambiguities. Then, in September 2024, crime novelist Michael Connelly, author of the best-selling Harry Bosch series and more than 80 million books sold worldwide, produced a 4-episode documentary series called The Wonderland Incidents and the Secret History of Hollywood. It premiered on MGM+. Connelly's series used the case as a lens into 1980s Hollywood corruption, the emergence of the substance epidemic, celebrity entanglement in organized crime, and the investigative compromises that allowed perpetrators to escape conviction. The documentary features original interviews with detectives Lang and Souza, Scott Thorson's final public testimony, recorded just weeks before he passed, and archival footage that emphasizes the strangeness of the evidence and the personalities involved. It doesn't provide a definitive answer, because there isn't one. The townhouse at 8763 Wonderland Avenue still stands in Laurel Canyon. Today, it's valued at approximately $970,000, a modest home in an expensive neighborhood. People live there now. They know the history or they don't. They sleep in rooms where violence once occurred, or they've remodeled and erased every physical trace. But history doesn't disappear just because you paint over it. The case remains officially unsolved. No one has been convicted of the actual attacks. Eddie Nash died, having admitted only to ordering the retrieval of stolen property. Gregory Diles died before federal charges could be formalized. John Holmes took his secrets to the grave. So what really happened? Here's what we know with reasonable certainty. On June 29, 1981, the Wonderland gang robbed Eddie Nash's home with inside help from John Holmes. They took approximately $1 million worth of substances, cash, jewelry, and other valuables. They shot Nash's bodyguard, Gregory Diles, during the robbery. Eddie Nash, humiliated and enraged, discovered that John Holmes had facilitated the robbery by wearing stolen jewelry. Nash's associates brought Holmes back to his home, where he was beaten and interrogated until he revealed the location of the people who had robbed him. 40 hours later, someone entered the Wonderland house with hammers and metal pipes and systematically attacked everyone inside. 4 people lost their lives. Susan Laurel survived with catastrophic injuries that erased her memory of the events. John Holmes's palm print was found on Ron Laurel's headboard, placing him at the scene either during or shortly after the attacks. Scott Thorson testified that he heard Eddie Nash order the violence, commanding his associates to end everyone who's there. But here's what we don't know with legal certainty. We don't know who actually struck the fatal blows. Gregory Diles is the most logical suspect. He had been shot during the robbery and had both motive and opportunity, but no physical evidence definitively placed him at the scene. No fingerprints, no blood, no forensic link that would satisfy a jury. We don't know if John Holmes participated in the violence or simply unlocked the door and stood by while others carried it out. His palm print suggests presence, not participation. But Sharon Holmes's testimony suggests he confessed to being there. Whether he wielded a weapon or simply watched is a question that died with him. We don't know if the decision to take everyone's life was made in advance or if it escalated in the moment. Eddie Nash's alleged order suggests premeditation, but the chaotic nature of the scene, the overkill, the ransacking, could indicate that the situation spiraled beyond what was initially planned. And we don't know if there were other participants who were never identified. People who entered that house committed violence and walked away without ever being suspected. The Wonderland case endures not because the evidence is ambiguous, but because institutional failures transformed a solvable situation into a permanent cold case. Jury tampering. A bribed juror who prevented conviction despite 11 other jurors voting for guilt. Witness credibility collapse. Scott Thorson, whose testimony was likely accurate but whose reputation made him easy to discredit. Conflicting law enforcement priorities. Federal authorities investigating Nash as a potential informant, while local police tried to build a case against him. Evidentiary insufficiency. The inability to forensically link suspects to the scene in a way that satisfied the standard of reasonable doubt. And the passage of time. By the time federal charges were filed, key suspects were deceased or dying, and witnesses had scattered or passed away. This is why the case remains chilling. It demonstrates that knowledge of guilt and legal conviction are not synonymous. The perpetrators may be known. Justice remains unpaid. Every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. The Wonderland case is Los Angeles' open wound. A reminder that Hollywood's golden facade conceals darker truths, that the people we elevate to fame are often the most vulnerable to exploitation. That organized crime doesn't just exist in movies. It thrives in the spaces between law and chaos, between evidence and proof, between what happened and what can be proven. If you walk through Laurel Canyon today, you'll pass houses where musicians once wrote songs that defined a generation, where actors rehearsed lines, where dreamers came to chase something bigger than themselves, and if you know where to look, you'll pass a townhouse on Wonderland Avenue, where 4 people lost their lives and a 5th lost her memory, and the truth became something that could be known but never proven. I think about Susan Laurel sometimes, the survivor. She walked out of that hospital with a partially removed skull, missing portions of her fingers, and a mind that couldn't reconstruct what had been taken from her. She couldn't tell the police what she had seen. She couldn't identify the people who had destroyed her life. The only living witness, locked inside a silence she didn't choose. There's a certain cruelty in that. To survive something so violent and to have no memory of it. To know intellectually that something terrible happened to you, but to have no emotional or sensory connection to the event. To exist in a permanent state of not knowing. Maybe that's the real horror of the Wonderland case. Not the violence itself, though that was horrific enough, but the way the truth dissolved into competing narratives and legal technicalities and the slow erosion of memory and time. Because cases like this don't just haunt the people involved, they haunt the system that failed to resolve them. They haunt the investigators who knew the truth but couldn't prove it. They haunt the families who watched perpetrators walk free, and they haunt us, the people who hear these stories and try to make sense of them, who want to believe that justice is more than a word, that the system works, that terrible acts have consequences. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The Wonderland case is a reminder that we live in the space between those two outcomes, where knowledge and proof diverge, where guilt and innocence become legal constructs rather than moral certainties. 4 people were taken on July 1st, 1981. Susan Laurnius lost her memory and a portion of her skull and any chance at a normal life. John Holmes took his secrets to the grave. Gregory Dials escaped justice and lived another 16 years. Eddie Nash accepted a plea deal that acknowledged the outcome without accepting full responsibility and lived to be 85. And the case remains unsolved. Not because we don't know what happened, but because knowing isn't enough. If stories like this stay with you, if you find yourself thinking about them long after the screen goes dark, then you understand why the Midnight File exists. These aren't just stories. They're warnings, reminders, glimpses into the spaces where systems fail and people fall through cracks, and truth becomes something negotiable. Subscribe if you want more. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment telling me what you think really happened, because the conversation doesn't end when the evidence runs out. It's just beginning. The file on Wonderland Avenue will never truly close. The townhouse still stands. The memories persist even when the witnesses are gone. And somewhere, the truth exists in its complete, unambiguous form. We just may never be allowed to see it. This is Julian Cross, and this is the Midnight File. Until the next case finds us. Stay curious. Stay questioning. And remember that the darkest stories are often the truest ones, because some files don't offer closure. They offer something more valuable. A mirror held up to the systems we trust, and the people we elevate, and the ways justice can be both pursued and denied. The Wonderland case is that mirror, and what we see reflected back is deeply, profoundly unsettling. Good night.